Boker Tov, everybody. Chodesh Tov. Good morning. Happy new month of Elul. This morning we're going to do sort of an interesting cross-section of the Parsha, of the book of Shoftim. We're going to look at some tensions inherent between this text from the Torah with other biblical texts from the wider Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, and then we're going to look a little bit through a lens of musicality. We're going to learn a little bit about the Makam system. If you don't know what that is, you will by the end of this 30 minutes, so fear not. And we will hopefully get to do a little bit of singing. So we're going to be, in some ways, all over the place, but thank God we have the Parsha at the center, sort of rooting us on our journey of learning this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and if it's not already in the chat, I think Julie has the link for the source sheet if people would like to open it in their own window. I can't see everybody at once, but could I have just a general thumbs up that people can see the chat, the source sheet? Excellent. All right. So we're going to start in the text of the Parsha itself, from Deuteronomy 17. So we'll read it and then we'll start to unpack it. But I would love if people want to raise their hand to get other voices in the room besides myself, if somebody would like to read the English right here, verse 14 and 15. Jay, awesome. We're going to take you off mute.
Go ahead, Jay.
If after you've entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations around me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman.
Awesome, Jay. Thank you so much for reading. Okay, so we have in here, after it's looking ahead, right, to after the people arrive in Eretz Israel and the kind of land that God has assigned to them. They may decide, like everybody else locally has a king, we would also like a king. It's not how the Israelites have been living in the desert, right? They've been under the authority of kind of both a prophetic and a priestly leadership. They have a locus of leadership in Moshe and Moses. They have a locus of leadership in Aaron, in the priests, the Kohanim. And God says, you may want a third option when you arrive in the land, because most groups are not governed by, a brother and a priest, two brothers, one who's a prophet, one who's a priest, who have this dual natured leadership. You might want something more standard. And at least according to this text in our Parsha in Deuteronomy, God says, that's okay. Just make sure that he is one of the people. You don't want a foreign ruler. We have many, many books in the Tanakh about what can go wrong if you have a foreign ruler who doesn't know your people and doesn't know your culture. And I'm going to stop the screen for a little bit just so we can unpack this. But part of what is happening in the rest of this Parsha, I wanted us to be doing some talking and thinking together, not just reading, so I didn't bring the whole text, is after God says, okay, it's all right to have a king, there then is a long, long list of all of the qualifications that the king needs to have. And it's actually very few qualifications about where the king comes from, just that the king needs to be an Israelite. But there's a lot of things about the king's conduct and proper behavior of that. They say the king shouldn't want to get a bunch of horses and should certainly not send people down to Egypt to get horses. We don't do that. And, the idea of the kingly regiment going down to Egypt would be unsightly given our history as people who left Egypt, so we're not going to do that. They say the king shouldn't have too many wives. They say, the king needs to be in close communication with the Levites. He should have a scroll that's supervised by one of the Levitical priests. There needs to be some kind of oversight and communication with our value system. A lot of Parashat Shoftim is about justice, right? The most probably well-known quote from this Parsha is Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice you should pursue. And Doug, I see that you put a question in the chat about, doesn't Samuel say we shouldn't have a king? We're getting there, I promise. You are the Navi of this class session. You are our prophet. You have pre-seen our source sheet. But yes, that there's this idea of, at least in the original Torah text, you should have a king, but the king needs to conduct the king's self in a certain way. And it all is coming down in these series of commandments about how to have a just society. of God is saying, you may make different choices, but here are your responsibilities to one another, and here is what it means to live justly in the land of Israel. And that means a lot of specific rules about your king. But yes, later in the Tanakh, in the book of Samuel, God seems to have a very, very different attitude. So I'll read this first one, and then we can have somebody read the second paragraph from Shmuel 8. But this is during the lifetime of the prophet Samuel. Many, many generations later, they're in the land. They've been governed by the prophet Samuel. Again, we've gone into kind of a mode of prophet leadership and his sons, but his sons are not very popular. And so the people come to Samuel and they say, all the elders of Israel assembled and came to the prophet Shmuel at Ramah. And they said to him, you've grown old and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Samuel was displeased that they said, give us a king to govern us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Samuel, heed the demand of the people and everything that they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king. So I would love to hear people's thoughts in the chat a little bit, and we can read 2 or 3 of what's popping up in the chat. So what's the attitude of God in Deuteronomy versus the attitude of God in the book of Samuel? What's changed? Because there seems to be a large attitude shift happening here, kind of very much from the top down, of like the emotional tenor of heaven has radically shifted towards whether or not a king is a good idea now that it's happening. Yes, so Carrie is saying, yeah, it appears that King Solomon did not get the message about how a king should act. I assume that's a reference to King Solomon's many, many, many wives. Yes, that are also kind of explicitly forbidden in our Torah text, but seem to be lived out differently in the wider Tanakh. Okay, great. We're bringing in some kind of biblical scholarship here. The idea that Deuteronomy could have actually been written very much later than the rest of the Torah. And so this text in Deuteronomy might have been written in response to King Solomon. Absolutely. Yeah, that it could be very, very written much later and written very pointedly. There may also be kind of reference of a struggle here too, right, between the priests and the king, if the text says really explicitly, like, and the king should definitely talk to the priests and figure out what they want, and like they should huddle up. Yes, there's a humility on the part of the king, but I want people to focus for a minute really specifically on this last line, on verse 7. For it is not you that the people have rejected. It's not the leadership of the prophet, says God, that the people have rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king. I want us to think about like the character of God in this verse. What is God worried about with the idea of human kingship at this point in our story? Like sometimes we say, what's troubling Rashi? I'm really curious, what's troubling God? Yeah, does God think God is the king? Absolutely. That's how it's been working. Is that the whole reason that they haven't yet had kingly leadership, that they've had prophetic or priestly leadership, the Israelites, is that God is the king. Yes, that humans can make God can kind of hold all of our demands as sovereign of the universe. That God says earlier that the land belongs to God, so that God in some way is sovereign. Absolutely. That what the Torah and what the larger Tanakh later is giving us is a vision of a different kind of leadership. I want us to keep in mind we have the Deuteronomy vision of leadership that is like we have a king, but he's very, very just, and there's lots of rules. And then this is a different model of leadership where sovereignty is not placed on a human being as responsible, but the preferable vision of sovereignty is one that exists for God. So we're going to look now at later on in the same chapter of Shmuel. So this is, Samuel kind of warns everybody, okay, if we have a king, this is what it's going to be like. It's going to be pretty bad. I just want to give you a heads up, like it's not going to go well for us. Here's what will happen to your sons, to your daughters, to our system of government. But it says, the people did not listen to Samuel's warning. No, they said, we must have a king over us so that we can be like all the other nations. So they're echoing the text in Deuteronomy. Let a king rule over us and go at our head and fight our battles. They're saying, we want a king for military reasons. So when Samuel heard all that the people said, he reported it back to the Lord. So Samuel right now is right. He's, as the prophet, he's the go-between. He's negotiating between God and between the people. And that God is both involved in this existence I'm seeing in the chat of the king and the prophets, absolutely. But here, God and the people are having a dispute, and Samuel is put in the middle as a negotiator. And I'm wondering, my other question I would love for us to think about for a minute is maybe what's God's version of what a king should be doing versus the people? If we have God's commandments from Deuteronomy that come very much about like ethical behavior, thoughtfulness, decision making, versus what are the people saying here, especially in verse 20, that they want a king to do? What are the two different models of what God thinks a king should be versus what the people in Shmuel Aleph seem to think the king should be? Seeing some really interesting stuff in the chat. Yes, okay, it's important to note that the concept of constitutional monarchy is not going to be invented for several thousand years. Yes, exactly, that to give a human being kingship is absolute power. In verse 20, there's this idea maybe that power is coming from the people have forgotten personal responsibility. Oh, I love this. It's written, unfortunately, with a bunch of numbers, so I can't credit it B'Shem Omro or B'Shem Omra and the name of the person who said it, but the people wanted a war hero and not a spiritual leader. Yes, that the definition of kingship has seemed to radically change in the hundreds of years between the Deuteronomy text and the Shmuel text, or just between the perspective of God and the perspective of the people. Tanya, thank you so much. That these people want somebody to rule over us, have this top-down leadership, to fight battles, to move ahead, and they want to be like everybody else, where God is saying, we have the option actually to have this very special relationship and to be different than other nations and to have a more kind of a model of spiritual leadership. Absolutely. So I'm curious for folks, like which model of leadership resonates most for you? The like sort of idea of Yedidia, of like you are the only and the beloved and you have a spiritual leadership, or one of like military might. I don't think there's a wrong answer here, and that's why our sacred texts are in a way bringing both options into the conversation. But I'm curious, which one resonates for you as a model of leadership that feels compelling? And the answer can totally be, I want a different one in different moments, right? Like sometimes we want leadership that does kind of provide this strong, stable top-down. Other times we may really gravitate towards a relational, spiritual sort of leadership, and a model that's built on divine relationship. I'm seeing Jay is leaning more towards the spiritual leader. Others may feel compelled about military or political. What I think is so interesting, one of the things I love about this text is that it seems that God has a really strong opinion, but God doesn't actually get the final vote. God is like, you really should avoid this, and yet the people wind up in the book of Samuel with not only a king, but a series of kings. Yes, Rose has pointed out there's space for a lot of despotism with top-down leadership, and I think that the book of Samuel, were we to read it in its entirety, is kind of a story about how that can manifest. I love this idea, spiritual primary has earthly military backup. God gives us choices. Yes, exactly. Is that Tanya again? Brilliant. Yes, that there's an element of choice here. In some ways, God is sort of the like permissive, long leash, big net parent almost in the Samuel text of like, you get to make the choice, but I'll make you aware of the consequences. But ultimately, it's up to you, and it's truly what you want. Yes, that there's choice here. It's not, even in that moment, God, I think, is modeling a kind of spiritual leadership of I'm going to make you aware of the consequences without compelling you to make your choice. But mostly what I wanted to lift up looking at these texts is that there's a tension here between what it means to be a king, what it means to be sovereign, and what sovereignty looks like in a justice lens within the Tanakh and within our Parsha. That I want us to be sort of holding this question of what does it mean to have sovereignty that is also just, or kingship that is also just, and our different models. Because I want to spend the end of our time together actually exploring this not with, not the kind of thoughtful analysis, but we're going to kind of switch our modality to a very different kind of thinking that's going to hopefully be a little bit more embodied. A really dear teacher of mine, Dr. Everett Fox, who translated the Bible and the book of Samuel and Kings, talks about actually the musicality inherent in the Torah text. We hear it sometimes if we go to shul with when the Torah is being chanted, right? For many of us, I imagine we're hearing it chanted with Ashkenazi Te'amim, but possibly not all of us. But I love this quote that I want to bring from Dr. Fox about the musicality of the text. He says, everything depends on the ear of the performer. The score, meaning the words on the page, just sit there silently on the page and have no reality until the musicians start to play and give it some form. So the score sits silently on the page and has no reality until the musicians start to play and give it some form. We know about Torah, right, that it's a book that's meant to be experienced multisensorily, right? We see it, we touch it, we kiss it, we listen to it. There's not just one pathway into this text, it's meant to be illuminated. And one way that it's illuminated is through the te'amim, but another one that I want to make us aware of is the makam system. And I would love to just see like show of hands. Are people familiar with makam, or does anyone attend a synagogue where makam is used during Torah reading? Seeing mostly some shaking heads. No, that is totally fine because thank God we're here this morning to learn. So makam comes from, it's an Arabic word, but it's related to the Hebrew word makom. And it's not quite a scale, but instead is like a musical mode that appears in Arabic music and has made its way to a lot of Mizrahi, I'm sorry if my dog is appearing on off camera, I'll tilt a little bit, a lot of Mizrahi Jewish communities all over the world based on Arabic musical reading, and it's a way of overlaying another level of meaning and emotion onto the Torah text or into the service, to use makam as part of our Torah reading. So it's very similar if you're used to Western music, like a mode of, it's not quite a scale, but it's a way to communicate a certain kind of emotion. The way I find helpful to think about it is like, where are we supposed to be sitting vis-a-vis this text? Like, what's the angle we're viewing it from? What's the mood or emotion? What's our place of viewing? That's our makam, or our place of listening. So different makamot are not just associated with different emotions, but also different parshiot, and they're supposed to reflect the theme or the idea in the communities that they're read of what's happening in the text. There's some more really well-known makamot, especially like Makam Husseini, which is used for the song El Eliyahu that some people may know from Havdalah. It's like, El Eliyahu, Biskut Eliyahu. You can hear that, the quarter tone, ow. It's not Western, but it's very beautiful. Maybe different than we're used to, but that's Makam Husseini. Typically, Parashat Shoftim is associated with Makam Ajam, which means, it's just from the word that means Persian. It's kind of a more Western scale. It's considered very beautiful, very upbeat, almost a little bit fanciful, or sometimes, and only a couple communities, a more archaic makam called makam jerka is used. And so they're not only used for Torah reading, but also for piyutim and pizmonim, for liturgical poetry that appear both inside the service and outside the service. If you are not familiar with pizmonim, they're kind of like zmirot in the Ashkenazi tradition. They're songs that are meant to add on an ornament, an occasion in some way. They're often in Hebrew, occasionally Ladino or Judeo-Arabic. I realize I'm throwing a lot of information, so use the chat. The chat is your friend. And Frana asked, are they rigid, or does the performer have some leeway? It's like jazz, right? Yes, the performer totally has some leeway about the intervals in the music, and where embellishments lie. Like if you know the makam, you're sort of the master of the actual notes and the experience in some way. Although when reading the Torah itself, it is still kind of gently hooked into the te'amim. So there are still cantillation marks, and the cantillation marks are telling you sort of when to go up and when to go down, just like in an Ashkenazi reading. So we are going to do a little bit of singing to look at how one pizmon in Makam Jerka sort of resolves some of this textual question. It's one potential answer to what does it look like to combine elements of kingship and leadership and a just vision of the world. So we're first going to look at the words a little bit in English as a text study. I will then teach us the chorus. We will sing the chorus on mute together, but we'll get to practice it a little bit. So this is what it looks like in the Pizmon book. You can see, like many wonderful Jewish piyutim, the author's name is Yair Amram, and he has stuck his name inside of the verses. So we have Yud, Aleph, Yud, Resh at the beginning of every verse. It's a way of sort of signing your name if you're a paitan, a composer of piyutim. So this song is called Shuv Zion. So I'll sing the chorus first. We heard it at the beginning also. And then we're going to look at and read the English text together before diving it back into Makam Jerka and like getting to marinate a little bit in the music of this parsha. So it goes like this. I'll sing it first as a nigun, or not really a nigun because it's Mizrahi music, but I'll sing it as a wordless melody, and then the words, and then we'll jump into the English text. Ay, 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 na, 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 na. Ay, na, na, ay, ay, da, 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 da. Ay, 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 da, 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 da. Ay, da, 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 ay, da, 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 da. Ay, da, 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 da. Ay, da, 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 ay, ay, da, 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 da. And again, because it's like it's a makam, so you can jump a little bit around, but I'm going to try to keep it standard with in mind that we're all learning it together. שוב ציון ברעננה, מבשרת עיניה עליך. שוב ציון ברעננה, מבשרת עיניה עליך. רוחי קמה לך חביבי, גם נישא לעיר אלתילה. And then if we were doing it with more accompaniment, we would hear the amazing like that we hear on the recording. I will not make any more strange mouth noises, but I appreciate you allowing me 2 or 3. And let me see if I can make this. I know that this is kind of a small text here, so hopefully this is a little more accessible. But I want us to look together, and again, the chat is your friend. As things come up, connections, questions, put them in the chat. But I'll read through the English text and then we can think about together that question. How is kingship and justice being combined in this text in a way that may elucidate the conversation we were having about the Parsha itself and the tensions in the Tanakh? Return, Zion, in joyful song. A messenger will deliver to you. My spirit longs for you, beloved, so yearned for this city of splendor. Unto your city, please, my parent. Please return, and I will be remembered by you. Do not remove your adorned ruler. You're wrapped in the splendor of my king, your billowing honor, God of grace. And I will foresee your king and princes. Then we have a chorus again. Next verse. Please take pity, God, upon my soldiers until they return to my border. They will not flee from my enemy, and I will call out for my salvation in my tears. Please, God, please, my God. To the dear ones, God will listen. To the beloveds, God will soon redeem. We have the chorus again. And then these 2 shorter verses at the end. God, look down from the heights of heaven. Rescue me from torturers. Deliver me and answer me. Chorus again. Mercy arrives and now heralds. My people returned to the city of Zion. So we're talking about Jerusalem, right? Zion is one of the names for the city of Jerusalem, but I want to take a look at the text of like, what comes up? What's a potential resolution for this tension of kingship and justice that this Pismon offers us? Please sing the whole song once we have it so we can record it. Yes, and I'm also happy to send, I would love to send like some like Tunisian chazanut of like people who are really, really dedicated to and are steeped in this tradition. As well, are men allowed to hear women sing in traditional Mizrahi culture? Mizrahi culture is not a monolith, so it really, really depends on which community you're talking about. I think just like in Ashkenazi Jewish communities, there are some communities that hold Kol Isha as a minhag, that hear men not listening to the performing voices of women when singing as a rule, and there are some that do not hold to that. But there's a lot of actually really fabulous, especially younger paitanits, different paitaniot, female performers of piyutim, coming especially out of Israel and the Middle East. Where can we learn more about this? The Pismon Project. I will put a link towards the end in the chat. But I want to be respectful of our time and let us have a little bit of time to sing together. Piyut is a liturgical poem. A Pismon is a liturgical poem that doesn't appear in the liturgy, but instead you might sing at your Shabbat table, at a wedding, at a bar mitzvah, at a bris, or a brit milah. So we're going to go through it again really slowly. So we'll do it about halftime. And once you catch on, sing along on mute. I'll say also, I know that singing in person on Zoom is not the same as singing in person with other people. A really great way to sort of get some of that body feedback and resonance that you would have in a room with lots of people is to actually, if you put your hands really gently on your voice box so you can hear it, or on the edges of your face really gently, or even here on your chest, it's a way to get resonance from your own body. It's not the same as the like joyful resonance of other people, but I do think I found it's a good way on Zoom to sort of sit in the more fully embodied experience of singing as a Jewish practice. So we'll go slow. Shuv Tzion biranana, מבשרת עיניה עליך, שוב ציון ברעננה, מבשרת עיניה עליך, רוחי קמה לך חביבי, גם נישא בעיר תהילה. And you can hear, right, there's like a jump from the really, really high, like, alecha down to the ruchi kama. You got to be ready for it, and try not to scoop. So it's not a alecha ruchi. We don't want that, but like take a breath. Alecha ruchi kama lecha chavivi gam nisapa leir altila. And I'll do one or two of the verses, and we'll move back to the chorus. Ya la'irach, ya na'avi, ya nashuv ונזכרכי, לא תסיר שוטן ודי, האתם מחודך מלכי, גל כבודך אל חנון, והקצה מלכי וסף, אנחוסה יעל הילי, עד השיבם אל גבולי, שוב ציון ברעננה, מבשרת עיניה עליך, שוב ציון ברעננה, מבשרת עיניה עליך, רוחי קמה לך חביבי, גם נישא בעיר תהילה. Beautiful. I wish I could hear each of you singing and we could have a gorgeous chorus. Maybe we're like beaming it out to space so somebody outside could listen to all of our streams at once. Thank you so much for spending the morning, a little bit of the morning with me and learning with me. Happy Elul again. I think another wonderful resolution to this question of kingship, right, is we say about Elul, the king is in the field. May we be blessed to experience some of that spiritual, soulful sovereignty in ourselves this month.